Hi, Dustin. Great having you on the show.
Hey, how are you? Great to be here. It's Blue Hoodie Day, if you haven't noticed.
Yeah, I have my cool new shirt of uh, hoodie that I'll show you in RSA when we meet there. So before we start, for those of you who are not familiar with us, my name is Eitan Volsel. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Mob, and joining me today is Dustin Lair. And Dustin, maybe you'll present yourself. Um,
Sure. Yeah, I'll go just briefly into my background because I spent over a decade as a software engineer and got into AppSec from there. Currently, I am Deputy CISO and Senior Director of Platform Security over at Fivetran, and then I also help people build security champion programs essentially through a company that I created called Catalyst.
Cool. And this is exactly why we are having this discussion today. Basically, Dustin and I have been talking recently a lot about how people are running their application security programs, product security, application security, maybe even security in general. And both of us have experience in what is working and what isn't working very much today. And both my company and what Dustin has experience with have a lot to talk about the topic. Basically, the idea is companies are spending a lot of money, time, resources, whatever you want to call, on scanning for security vulnerabilities, triaging, assigning priorities and SLAs for them, and it doesn't feel that it moves the needle in the right direction in actually making your program more secure. And this is what we wanted to talk about because we had both of us had a lot of discussions with other companies on how they can improve their progress, let's say, or their program and actually get to the results that they want to do. And so, Dustin, I appreciate that you joined us today. And just recently, we were in your virtual meetup, the one that you're doing with two other esteemed colleagues, and they were talking about ASPM. So maybe we'll start with that. From your experience, share some of the what people are doing today and what's not that great about it, but why are they still? That's the only approach that they find. Maybe we'll start there.
Yeah, definitely. I think there's a lot to unpack here. The meetup that you mentioned is Let's Talk Software Security. This is actually where Aiden and I met. A lot of great discussions happen in that meetup. So we kind of have talked about this over time. And I think people are struggling here in general. And I think there are things that aren't working. And I want to go into detail here as we go forward. But I also want to just mention that maybe we need to start thinking about things a little bit differently. And I think this is a good forum for us to sort of explore this and go back and forth and talk about, what's working, what's not, and how can we possibly have different approaches. I think the state of it is really um, as everybody sort of approaches this space in AppSec in general and security in general, I think there's a lot of heavy focus on tools. How do we get more visibility into our environment, specifically the vulnerabilities that exist? So folks purchase a tool, right? They let's just say SAST, static application security testing tool, and they point it at their repositories and they scan the code. And what happens is there's a lot of findings that come out of that, right? There's a lot of vulnerabilities that pop up that are found in the raw code. So I think as security teams are challenged with, light resources, they don't have necessarily a huge team staffed up on the security side. So what they end up doing is throwing those results over the wall to a large extent over at the developers. Hey, we found this in your code. Go fix these things. And naturally, there's a lot of pushback. And I think there's a lot of pushback for several reasons. One, I think that developers in general are confident in the code that they wrote. So it's a little bit of a reaction like, well, wait a minute. You did what to my code? You scanned my code and you're basically calling my baby ugly at this point. That starts us off on the wrong foot to begin with, right? And the other thing is developers are smart and they know their code and they know the context where their code runs. So when they see a result that's from a raw scan tool that maybe doesn't have the context needed to really make the call whether or not this is a true positive or a false positive, developers will push back there too, and they'll say, "Well, this isn't relevant. This finding isn't relevant for a number of reasons. One, it doesn't make any sense. It's just straight up false positive. Two, it might lack the context. Maybe it ran against a code base that was, a testing code base, or it's something that's not even exposed, publicly. Maybe it's some internal tool. So they're like, well, what is the priority of fixing this? How can this be a critical if this is just some non-public internal use, research assignment that one of the developers created, right? So
Yeah.
there's a lot of pushback there, and I think, obviously a lot more time needs to be spent on delivering valid results and triaging, like we've started to talk about here, to really get relevant results in front of the developers, which I think naturally leads us to the conversation around how do we add context to these findings? How do we take what we know about the environment and where the code runs and what assets, the code pertains to and so forth, and actually adjust severities and better communicate priorities of these things to the developers? And I think that's where the ASPM space is trying to go. Not only orchestrating results across multiple tools and deduping and making it a little bit easier for developers to digest, but also adding more context. There's a bit of an inventory element to those things too. And if these ASPM tools are doing it right, and if you're sort of approaching this in the right way, you want to talk about risk. You don't just want to talk about individual vulns that a scan tool found. You want to actually talk about how does this impact us, and what is the relevance of this. So there's a lot going on there. I know that I said a lot, but
Yeah.
I think that's kind of the state of things and where we're starting to head.
Yeah, I think maybe I rushed into it because at the beginning there is a thought of why should a company even have an application security program, right? Right, define the goals of your program, and for some, sadly, even today, for some, it's just okay. We need to meet the compliance. We don't care about anything. We will just run scans. I think that this webinar, I mean, if you're one of those, this webinar is not for you. No offense, you can hang up now and move to your continue your day. And if you are, by the way, just my thought, stop spending money on commercial tools. Just use open source and tick the box. But if you actually care about security, I want to say one comment on what you mentioned earlier, the true positive and false positives. There is a misleading concept in the industry sometimes that if a tool reports a problem in the code, sorry, that false positives means that the tool reports issues that don't make sense. False positive in the industry is also referred to bad code practice, but as you mentioned, I'm not impacted by it, either because it's testing code or internal code, or even because I have another mitigation. And that's related to the context that you mentioned, right? The developer will know that this method may have, maybe the code is not great there or even vulnerable, but it will never be exploitable because A, B, and C other mitigation factors. And no company would want to spend developer time on fixing something that is not broken. And that is also where security teams and developers have clashes, because developers are being asked to fix something that's not broken, right? And that's the
Yeah.
context. That's also part of the context. So we were talking about the context of, should I care about this application or should I not? Should I care about this part of the application or not? All those are related to the risk, but also let's say that it is a risky application and it is something that I should care about, but it's not exploitable. And I have another job to do, another task, another area that is, and how do I balance those? So all that is related to the triage. Some of it can be related to what ASPM can do with reachability and all those, but this is a tool. And I want us to speak a little bit beyond the tool, right? So what do people do today? We mentioned triaging, basically looking at the different issues and figuring out, should I fix this? What is the CVSS score, or however else I want to score it, and prioritize. And that's the first step. And then there is the lovely assigned SLAs. So maybe we'll dive into that. Share a little bit some more context on why do people assign SLAs and what actually happens to them after.
Yeah, now, before we get on to that, I want to touch on something really quick because I think you started to head this direction.
Sure.
And I do think that there needs to be a partnership established between engineering and security as well. Like I mentioned, just throwing results over the wall, I think there's opportunities to learn on both sides. The security can learn a little bit more about the context of the findings, by talking to engineers, and vice versa. As the engineers go through the triage process and so forth and figure out, hey, these aren't valid, they can get back to the security team, and hopefully you have a good relationship established there where you can work together toward solutions. Otherwise, like without that relationship, and I think we've all sort of seen this in general, especially in the working environment. If you're not comfortable having a conversation about an issue and challenging each other, you become sort of jaded, and the gap widens. So I think if you're going to be effective in terms of pursuing these findings, you have to work on that relationship. You have to meet with folks often. You have to have that very clear, good working relationship. So, and I think that leads us right into talking about SLAs. You mentioned compliance. I think a big piece of where SLAs come from, is compliance in general. There's just straight requirements. Like you need, for PCI, I think you need to fix criticals and highs within 30 days, as an example. Period. That's imposed on you to a certain degree from an external body, as opposed to sort of an internal effort that maybe you set your own SLAs that are reasonable. And I've gotten into this conversation quite a bit. Like, look, if our development teams aren't fixing highs even within 100 days, then how can we hold them to 30? And does it make a lot more sense to, sort of meet them where they are a little bit, and then give them stretch assignments like, hey, instead of 100, let's just try for 90. Let's start there. Let's try 90, see if we can hit that mark, and then continue to back it off. But unfortunately, in a lot of cases, we don't have that privilege because of compliance requirements, right? So there's that. And then I think the other thing to talk about when it comes to SLAs is it's like weaponized, by the security team to a large extent. Like, hey, fix this within 30 days. I don't care about your situation. Hackers don't give a crap about your situation. Just fix the issue within 30 days without trying to understand like the business context for doing so, tech debt type of concerns, like maybe this isn't the right time to take a time out and fix all of our vulnerabilities because our business is at risk, which is something else that should be considered. Like if you don't have a business, who cares about security?
Yeah.
So there's a lot of focus that has to be just on what does the business need? What do we actually need to sustain ourselves and grow and do everything we need to survive in the market, So
Yeah, I think that's also related to some of the discussions that I saw online with is the CISO more of a chief risk officer now, and all that discussion, because at the end, the high that we mentioned, the high severity, is in the context of just that security vulnerability, without the context of, is this, as you mentioned, is the application is risky, but also worst case scenario, what will happen if it's exploitable? What will be the damage to the business versus having the developer doing something else now and pushing the business forward? And that is something that is strongly missing. And then, is it really high? If I have a high severity vulnerability in my application, it has a high impact on my business, I think that 100 days is crazy. It needs to be addressed quickly. But security often don't have that context. And as you said, they need to talk, that discussion with the development team, with the product team, with the business owner needs to be there. And the business owner needs to know, okay, what is the risk? We know that there is a problem. We see it in the code. We have some tool that said it. Worst case scenario, what happens? Like discussions that I have with my attorney, with legal team when I go do a business with another company. I want to understand all the risk before I make the decision. The legal team will not stop me from making that decision, same way that the security team shouldn't stop me from making what is right for the business. That's how I see it.
yeah, I think that's very true. And, I think one of the things that people should focus on a little bit more is understanding the current behavior in the environment. Like taking a step back and saying, okay, well, what are we doing today? What I think ends up happening is, and a lot of this I think is driven by compliance. It might even just be, a non-human centric approach that a lot of security people have, where, it's like, hey, just do it. And there's not a whole lot of analysis in terms of what is the current behavior. And given the current behavior, where do we go from there? Like you said, maybe 100 days to fix this critical vulnerability is completely unacceptable. But that's the habit that we're in today. So how do we take what we're doing today and make incremental changes without just blanket saying, hey, everybody should fix criticals within 30 days, period, starting tomorrow? That's not going to be well received. And it's frankly a little bit ignorant in terms of, that's not how the business has been running. So if you're going to try to impose that, all you're going to do is create enemies. So I think that
Yeah.
that's something that needs to be taken into account, current behavior, and then trying to figure out what are those incremental changes. And maybe there's only a few of those critical issues that are worth fixing right now, and spending time to demonstrate why those are issues to help the organization learn about, those specific things and exploits and how exactly the attack chain would work, in terms of exploiting the vulnerability. That would be worthwhile. And maybe your efforts should be focused on those types of things to shift, the culture over time. And I think it's going to take a lot of time is kind of the point. But the first step is definitely understanding where you are today, and then also setting like a clear goal. Like, here's where we want to get to, right? We want to get to 30 days or less than that. Maybe customers, request that criticals are fixed quicker. We want to get there. So what are the steps to getting there?
Yeah,
You know?
so we are more or less covered what happens today, and right, security don't own development, so they can't tell developers what to do. They can beg and steal and try that, and we're going to talk a little bit about that, how to do it properly. But at the end, as we mentioned, SLAs are being assigned, and those 180 days for a minor severity issue, some point will come, half a year from now, and then you have all that load, and then you go and ask for exceptions from leadership, right? The actually fixing the problems is lacking because developers don't know what to fix. Um, which of the highs, which of the 1,000 highs that you have in my backlog do you want me to address first? There is no, you can't have everything priority one. So let's talk a little bit about what is the cost of not doing this, right? So um, basically, if I'm not addressing any of the findings, if I'm not addressing the problem, let's not even talk about the vulnerabilities. If I'm not addressing the problem, then I have a program that finds a lot of vulnerabilities, reports. Let's change it. Reports a lot of findings in my system, and I'm not doing anything, or I'm trying to continue assigning, triaging, assigning SLAs, and hoping for the best. So some thoughts here.
Yeah, I mean, I would probably start with the last bullet. I think sort of the meaning behind the work that we do is really to protect our companies at the end of the day. That should be the ultimate goal, right? Preventing a breach, preventing the business from being affected reputationally, or having data stolen, or having customer data stolen, or whatever that is. That's kind of the end goal, right? And I think a lot of people in the security industry feel driven by that. Like, how do I get my company to perform better when it comes to securing our environment so that we can be better protected against attackers at the end of the day? So I think that's a major cost, and I think that there's some scare tactics in there, but I do think clearly communicating what the risk is to the business is obviously, that has to be a priority. That has to be a conversation that happens all the way up the chain, even to the board, in a lot of cases. But there's some more, I guess, and that's very, it's hard to put your arms around that, right? Because it's like there's a risk, and I think that's the right conversation. What is the risk of something happening? But without it happening, or without it happening, immediately in front of you, or even to a similar company and so forth, it's all just conceptual.
Yeah.
This could happen, and I think there's a lot of pushback to that, because there's a lot of, well, we do things differently here, and even though that happened to that company, maybe that couldn't happen to us. So it's very easy for people to sort of have an out there. Okay, but the more immediate costs of inaction, I believe, are around um, loss of customers and just not meeting requirements of customers at the end of the day. And I think this is where we see sort of a shift in the industry,
Yeah.
which has only come about in the last, I don't know, 5 years, where more customers are asking about this. There's a lot more attention, like, hey, there's this brand new vulnerability against this library. And customers are reaching out and saying, hey, are you exposed to this issue? Can you also check if your vendors are exposed to the issue? So all of that attention is actually bringing some of these issues way more to the forefront, which I think is a really good thing because it does cause us to have to house clean, and make sure that we get our ducks in a row so that we can make our customers happy. So anyway, so I think that's one of the very immediate sort of tangible costs of inaction.
I think that what you referred to in the past few years is due to the high visibility of the log4js and the struts and all those. What I feel in the past few months actually is that this software supply chain discussion, the secure software supply chain discussion, hit the mark on people understanding that they are part of that supply chain. If I am a software company and I provide my services to another company, whether they are software or not, I'm part of their supply chain. It's not just for open source projects. So if in the past the risk was more of, oh my God, something bad can happen, you will have a security breach and you will lose credibility in the market, you will lose a lot of money because you actually need to compensate all your customers. Now it's not just that, because as a software company, I have a lot of third parties that I'm using. If they have a vulnerability, I'm going to be impacted and their vulnerabilities become my vulnerability. If I'm using a third party, I will want to know that they comply with all sorts of security certifications or restrictions. I will want to know about their program. So I do hear more and more from companies that they are, tuning up their policies to actually start fixing because their customers are asking for it. And I think, as a consumer, this is awesome. Now companies will be held responsible, not just if there is a breach, but also if they want to do business with other companies. As a business owner, it's scary also, because now I need to address all those issues that I could earlier put in the backlog and give exceptions to and hope that nothing bad can happen. So yes, the
Yeah,
cost of this inaction is bigger than just, the come back to bite you. It's not just security breach. It's also now I want to land another company, another customer, and they want to see my backlog or want to see a report, not just a certification, but actually a report. And it has hundreds of things that I need to fix by 2 weeks from now or something. Doesn't
yeah,
make sense.
yeah. And I kind of skipped over the loss of certifications and auditor checks, maybe a little bit on purpose. I do think there's more of an opportunity, and I think I'd like to see more call to action for the auditors to be looking at things a little bit deeper, which I don't think happens today. I think there's a lot of very quick check the box things like, hey, do you have a scan tool? Bring up the scan tool. Yeah, here's 100 results. Okay, cool. You have a scan tool. Check. It's like that doesn't actually indicate that you have a secure environment. Or do you have a policy? Do you have a policy, of show me your vulnerability management policy? So you bring it up and they're like, cool. They don't say, does anyone follow this?
Yeah.
In which case you might say, well, not really, not across the board. Some teams do, and I think that there's a little bit of a disservice there that I do think, I'd like to just see more attention on that and more almost accountability on the auditors plate in
Yeah.
terms of, hey, if there is a breach, some of it, in my view, should come back to the fact that, they passed an audit, and it should potentially talk about supply chain of like auditors should eventually go back to the auditor and say, well, why did you pass this? Why did you pass this company if they had this issue, right?
At the end, in order to pass that certification, an audit, you need to attest that you're following those policies, which means that if I sign that, actually in our case, it was Jonathan, our CTO, but he will be his ass on the line. And I do agree that if he signed things that we are doing, he should, and we are not, he should. But if the auditor missed something that he should have caught, that auditor needs to be put in the spot also. I completely agree. It's too easy to pass security audits.
Yep.
Not saying for us, saying in general in the industry. So, but from the business perspective, auditors will grow to be more responsible, I believe. And then if I want to do a business with someone in California, for example, there is their certification that you need. If now I want to do that business and I have a long backlog of issues with SLAs that I keep missing all the time and get exceptions, I won't be able to do those business there, and that will impact
Yep.
my business, my bottom line. So that come back to bite you is way more than just a hacker coming in. It's actually lose of business from without that happening.
Absolutely.
But let's talk a little bit about how it impacts the productivity then, right? We have the big backlog. We have this bad habits of pushing things to later. And if we don't address the core problem, which is we have hundreds and hundreds or thousands of high severity vulnerabilities. Hey, developers, you need to fix it. Something that does it just doesn't work, right? It's like coming to your kids and tell them again and again, oh, you won't see TV for a year. No, the sword that you put over their head needs to actually meet the risk. So I don't I don't see how companies can pull out of the mess that they are in if they're just adding more and more vulnerabilities to their backlog without that context, without proper way of addressing them. I mean, I know that people
Yeah.
reach out to you for the security champion and how to the security champion program, how to build it. Maybe share a little bit from your perspective, the impact on productivity and how what companies should do in order to address it
Yeah.
better.
Yeah. I mean, a few thoughts because I think you're touching on, why I like to put so much focus on proactivity, being proactive and preventing security issues. And there's this statement that I have in my head, and that's, why is there always time to fix issues when they come up, but there's never enough time to build it right to begin with, right? Why are we in that cycle of like fighting fires all the time, which seems to be acceptable? And I think part of that is a little bit of this like hero CISO culture to a large degree. Like, hey, I swooped in, there was an alert and I prevented a breach, and that was awesome. Okay, on to the next fire, as opposed to, oh, hold on, why did the breach happen? How do we do like a proper root cause analysis and fix our processes, habits, and so forth to prevent something like that from happening again? There's not enough focus on that in general. And I think some of this comes from this sort of startup mindset to a large degree, which I think is a good thing. Like I mentioned before, you got to build a business first. That's the first priority. I'm a security person and I'm telling you, security is second priority, not first priority. First priority, do what it takes to survive as a business or thrive even.
Yeah.
And I think, especially as an early company, the focus is not necessarily on perfect security, and it shouldn't be. It should be building a product, finding your market fit, getting your product out the door, starting to get customers and so forth. And I think as you get those customers, now you're introducing more risk to your business. If you have zero customers, you don't have any risk. Who cares if it gets breached? There's no data from customers and so forth. But as soon as you start getting customers, now you are starting to accumulate more risk. And if you don't turn around and patch up those security issues that you avoided to begin with, you're going to end up in a world of hurt. And I think that's where companies go wrong. It's like startup phase, fine, build whatever it takes. But the problem is then companies will just continue to do that forever. Let's continue to do features and stuff. And their tech debt accumulates and they don't come back around and fix up and patch up and, harden their software essentially. And I think that's a mistake. And I think that people need to sort of change that mindset. Like, okay, this works now. Let's reduce our risk. Let's become more proactive in our environment in general. And you mentioned security champions. There's a couple of major reasons that I like to help companies build security champion programs. One is there's a lot of reasons actually. I'm going to probably list a few. One is that relationship that I mentioned before. Like, I think a big benefit of security champions is that those are your allies. When you first come into a company and you're a fresh security team, and you don't have those relationships established, what you want to do is start putting feelers out. Like find the people who have been saying this for a while. Hey, I've been talking about tech debt forever. I'm very interested in quality. I want to make sure that we button things up. That's one of your first allies, right? And there are people across your environment that are allies, and they're sitting there waiting to be activated, to be reached out to, so that you can start to work with them and create a movement. Essentially, it's all about that culture change at the end of the day. And I think starting with people who already get it to a large degree or have an interest in security is a really good place to start. It also focuses on those proactive controls, right? Things like training. Like, how do you get ahead of that? Once you've proven that, there are issues in this environment and you've done some root cause analysis and you've figured out some of the process should change, our developers aren't necessarily coding securely, you can start to introduce training and sort of these left side, shift left, whether or not you like that term could be debated another day, but I think shift left, is a smart concept. And that basically means, how do you get ahead of this stuff? How do you introduce training? How do you introduce standards for your developers to get ahead of it? And I think finding allies to help you through that is a major benefit. Otherwise, you're alone.
But
You're alone. You're also missing context. Like, these early allies can help you understand the environment. They can help you understand how their teams work. They can translate your messaging. If you're like, hey, we need to be more proactive and reduce tech debt, and they're like, hey, that's a great idea. Here's what it means for my team. And they can sort of be that liaison and have the context of their team plus the context of security because they're working with you. So there's a lot of benefits. And
yeah,
this is why, I mean, you could probably tell I'm getting excited, because when I see these programs work, they just make all the difference. It's really incredible to see.
so I think we jumped ahead, but I want to make sure that people understand, ladies and gentlemen, you heard from a security person here that first you need to be a target before you start to protect that target, right? If you are not aiming to be that target of a security hacker, then I mean, if you don't have a good solution, you're not a target, you're not interesting, but you will run out of money also before you are a target. Make sure, try to be a target, right? Make sure you're big enough and successful enough, because otherwise hacking is not your biggest problem. You will run out of money, you will run out of business, and the business will die. So first you do that. And by the way, it reminds me on, as you said, the startup works. Developers, when you develop a new startup, being there, well, am there now still. At the beginning, you just try out stuff. You're not even worried about scale. You're not worried about performance. Let's make sure that what I have, someone is interested in it. But the good thing is that the dev side learn how to move from that part to the part of, okay, now I need to scale it. I have a lot of tech debt. Maybe I have a lot of code that will be throwaway. That was part of the plan. And security, even if they come late, they don't, I feel that sometimes they don't understand that company comes with a huge amount of baggage and now need to prioritize. And that is where, it impacts productivity. As this slide says, there is a huge tech debt, and that tech debt is just growing if you're continuing the same approach of every finding treated equal, every problem treated equal, and you miss the context, as you mentioned, for what does it mean for business and what does it mean for the developers to do what you're asking them. So maybe we'll now talk about the new approaches that exist, which includes the culture change, as you mentioned, and the security champions. Just for people to remember, you don't own developers, you don't own the business. You are there to help your business drive forward. You're here to use your developers to help the business drive forward. They don't report to you. Security champions will help do that bridge, as you mentioned, understand what developers need to do, and bring to the room the product managers, if you want, the business owners, so you will understand and look at it as incremental steps. So focus on the biggest problems first. I don't think that you can do that without having your counterpart, those that actually need to fix a problem there. So you touched security champions, but maybe can you share a little bit about more what is a security champion even? I know that we are used to that term and many of the people are, but what is it?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll keep that brief and then we can expand on it. But, the idea is you have people who are non-security professionals who are positioned in their teams across your environment that essentially become representatives of security, right? So they're liaisons, right? So the idea again is to recruit those initial allies across your company, again, not security professionals, to start a conversation, and what that looks like varies from company to company. I've seen programs at this point that are all volunteer based, and it's just, hey, we've got a group of people, very grassroots type of effort. We've got a group of people who are interested in security. We meet every month. They learn things. They take their learnings back to their team, and so forth. And in a lot of those cases, even those grassroots programs, they become much larger than that. They become something that's a little bit more official. There's also the top down approach. If you can make a case for, hey, in order for us to be efficient and scale security across the company, leadership, we need your support in identifying those folks across the company who are going to help us. I mentioned some of the benefits before as well for having security champions, like they understand the context of their teams. And I think that's one of the most powerful reasons to have security champions. Could you imagine as a relatively small security team, running around and having to understand the context of how all the different teams work so that you can tailor your message to each one of them so that they understand it? Impossible. But if you have an ally on each of those teams, they can now translate what you're trying to say into the context of their team. And then also, no offense, people are more likely to listen to them, someone that's a peer of theirs, than they are to you as a security person, right? It's easy to say, oh, Dustin's talking about security again. He's just a security guy, whatever. Versus, hey, my peer who I respect, who I work with every day, mentioned that this was a good idea, that this is a security best practice, and so forth. So that's the power of sort of having those security champions.
But I think one of the biggest challenges, and you and I talked a little bit, and you trashed my idea, but that's okay. How do I get those developers to become security champions, right? They went to dev because they wanted to do that. Maybe they have some interest in security. Maybe they never heard about it and it seems, oh, this is cool. How do you identify them? How do you get them to understand the value of what they do, and not just understand, actually like it, actually want to do this? Seems extremely challenging knowing that that developer has their day job that was defined to them by their manager, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think especially for early champions, there does have to be that very strong interest, and a lot of it can center around quality. I do think that there are people that stand out that have a little bit more of a focus on not just making it work, but making it work well and thinking about the bigger picture. How do we make this more maintainable? How do we build better quality software? They don't need, and one of the goals of having a champion program is not to turn everyone into a security professional. This is not the goal. The goal is really to enhance their knowledge at the end of the day. So anyway, so I think there are those people, but you make a good point in terms of, well, how do you get people across that line to a certain degree where they actually do care about security? And I think one of the approaches that I like to use is thinking about how do you introduce more extrinsic types of incentives and rewards to get them involved to begin with. As an example, as a security champion, you might have access to things, trainings, and so forth that you wouldn't otherwise. And therefore, if you do learn more, setting up some sort of a system where people gain status and people are recognized by the extra work that they do as a security champion can have a career impacting effect. And people know that, and they say, oh, okay, look, security champions are being promoted. Like the ones that are working harder and maybe achieve like a higher belt level or whatever leveling system you set up or status system that you set up. If people see that people are being rewarded for that stuff, they're going to want to get involved, even if just for their own selfish interests. Like, well, this could help advance my career. Okay, but here's what happens.
Yeah, I want to caution one thing here because I don't want people to get the wrong impression, which is like I told you, hey, maybe we gift them with some tangible objects, swag or whatever. And it's not, rewarding is not just that. Rewarding is completely not just that. And that's what we're.
Totally. Yeah, I mentioned access. So I'll leave folks with a acronym that I like, and it's SAPS. Okay, it stands for status, access, power, and stuff. And these are the different types of rewards that you can give people. It's not all stuff. It's not all money. It's not all bonuses and gift cards. There's things like status. Like think about if you get promoted, as an example. What do you care? Do you care about the extra money, or do you care about the increased title and responsibility and respect that comes with that title? That's probably